to start our event on COVID, neoliberalism, and the Arab Spring with Professor Gilbert Achcar. Perhaps it's appropriate to begin introducing today's topic, our panelists, and actually the hosting organization. Today, we are coming to you from Jerusalem, the Kenyon Institute, which is the Jerusalem-based branch of the Council for British Research in the Levant. CBRL, as our acronym reads, is an independent UK research charity and membership organization that exists to conduct and support research in the humanities and social sciences across the Levant region. We're part of a larger grouping of British international research institutes known as the BIRI, and we're provided with sponsorship from the British Academy. But we also are a membership and charitable organization which enables us to conduct further research in addition to our core costs. We have over 100 years of experience in the region and today have branches both in London, Amman, and in Jerusalem, from where this broadcast is taking place. In normal times, we host a regular program of lectures in the UK as well as our local institutes. Let me introduce my esteemed guest, who is Professor Gilbert Achcar. He is coming today from London, where he lives, and is a teacher at the School for Oriental and African Studies, where he has been a professor there since 2007, but before which he also was a teacher in Beirut, in Paris, and in Berlin. His many books, published in upwards of 15 languages, include The Clash of Barbarism, The Making of the New World Order, that's subtitled The Making of the New World Order, The Middle East and US Foreign Policy, also co-authored with Noam Chomsky, a well-received volume on the Arabs and the Holocaust, the Arab-Israeli War of Narratives, which came out in 2010 from Metropolitan Books, if I'm not mistaken. And perhaps most relevant for this discussion, two books discussing what are known as, what are informally referred to as the Arab Spring. The first was The People Want, a radical exploration of the Arab uprisings, which came in 2013, together with a follow-up volume known as Morbid Symptoms, Relapse in the Arab Uprisings, which came out in 2016, giving follow-up analysis to the evolution of the revolutionary upheavals across the region. So please join me in thanking Professor Achcar for his presence today. We certainly have a lot of things going on in the Middle East and a lot of things to probe your mind about today. Gilbert, before we actually jump into those subjects, I'd like to just sort of set some ground rules or just explain how things are going to run. Essentially, we have, there's up to 100 people who will be attending the Zoominar and who have the rights to be able to send in their questions and answers. So please feel free, if you are in the Zoom room, to actually send us questions and answers from the question and answer tab. Otherwise, as I mentioned, we will be live streaming this from our Facebook pages on the London and Jerusalem accounts. And otherwise, I think it's, we will try to be on point with time. I will start this discussion with Professor Achcar for about 35 to 40 minutes and then take those questions and hopefully have a fruitful discussion from there. So allow me to use that long introduction to say hello. Thank you for joining us, Gilbert from Jerusalem. It's truly amazing to be able to speak to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stas.
Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for CBRL. Thank you for Sarah, who's organizing it technically.
Yes,
and
blessed.
Pleasure to be with you all.
Thank you. So before, I'd like to try and start this discussion in a way that can help our viewers be sort of carried along with some of the analysis that you've provided in the past, as well as what you see is going on now. And to do that effectively, I think we have, a set of loaded terminology going on in our titles here. So to help break that down for us, can you start by giving us a bit of an understanding of what you mean when we discuss the term neoliberalism as a term? I generally tend to feel that this terminology is sort of a large catchphrase that is used to sort of, say many things, but it's too unspecific to actually mean anything. So for the purposes of this discussion, can you please try and give us a little bit of your understanding of what you mean by neoliberalism, both as a theoretical model as well as something practical?
Yeah, well, you're right to start with that, because indeed it's become a catchphrase, and we tend to assume that everybody knows what we're speaking about when we use the term, although it might mean different things to different people. People may understand it differently. But well, if I had to give a definition of it, I would start by saying it is an ideology which believes that the private sector should be the driving force and the engine of the economy, with an extremely minimal reduction of the role of the state. Basically the principle of that is that the state should interfere only where where the private sector can't replace it. Basically, it's the reverse of some views. So in that perspective, there are no public services or whatever, as long as the private sector can provide them. They should be provided by the private sector and not by the state, however public they are. And of course, this kind of ideology entails, therefore, privatization of public services or whatever kind of activities that are run by the state. It entails deregulation, that is the principle of free market and the free enterprise taken to the extreme. In a variant of it, which is the one that is applied in most of the world, except in the United States of America, which has the privilege of telling the rest of the world, do what I say, don't do like what I do. You have austerity, which means the state budget should be reduced to the minimum and should be brought back to equilibrium. And there's an abhorrence of the idea of deficits and debts and all that. So that's what you had. And of course, it's no coincidence that the key leverage for the global expansion of this neoliberal paradigm in the 80s, this global paradigm that was pioneered by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan as rulers, and a bunch of economic theoreticians, of course. It's also an economic school, but those who were at the helm were driving this pushing for this were Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, essentially. The leverage to expand that to the global south in particular has been the debt issue, the debt problem that had accumulated in the 70s with all sorts of reasons, one of them being oil prices that shot up in the 70s. And that was a key leverage in forcing what was called the Washington Consensus, which included the so-called structural adjustment programs, forcing countries to massively reduce their state expenditure, and therefore at the expense of social expenditure, health expenditure, and the rest. And opening their borders. So the end of protectionism or attempts at fostering the development of national industries, but just the principle of the free market, which got embodied in the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So that's what we call neoliberalism, especially when applied to the global south, which is our main focus of interest in this discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that explanation. It's very helpful to have that established first. If we move on to the second concept in our title, which is...
By the way, since you yourself are specialists of the problems, so please, if you want to add anything to what I said in this definition, you should go ahead.
I think you did a very good job of that, I would say. I mean, part of my question had to do with the difference with trying to get you to articulate the difference between the theoretical and utopian models of neoliberalism versus the actual lived ones, because these are going to be actual aspects that we begin to see in how they respond to the COVID crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I don't know if you want to say anything there, but I mean, basically, that it's a good segue. If you allow me to segue,
no, I mean,
into, go ahead.
The COVID crisis just. Some people are going through wishful thinking in believing that it is bringing neoliberalism to an end, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, there is some ground for such belief, which is the fact that all states have expanded hugely their economic intervention, their intervention in the economy by injecting trillions of dollars, if you take it globally. It's absolutely huge what's going on, and therefore also accumulating a huge debt. Mm-hmm. But the issue is that I think it would be very optimistic to believe that that in itself would mean an end of neoliberalism. They see it just as emergency measures that they have to take. And actually, I think that it is much more likely that they would say that due to this huge accumulation of debt, we need more austerity and more of those neoliberal measures that they have been implementing over the last few decades. That's what is actually more likely to happen. That is another aspect of it is, I doubt that they would say, well, let us raise the taxation on the rich, so that we reimburse this debt and we keep injecting funds in the economy, which would be needed for quite a long while to come. The balance, the social balance of forces is such that since we have governments completely dominated by finance capital and the very rich, and in a world in which social inequalities have deepened tremendously, to the point that it has become a best-selling theme for books like Thomas Piketty and some other books. So their inclination will rather be to let the people pay, to let the working class pay, to cut salaries, to freeze benefits and all that. That will be more their inclination than massively increasing taxes for the upper levels. And the argument will be, supply side economics. We shouldn't frighten money out of business. We should, in order to keep money in business, we should have low or very moderate rates of taxation. And in saying that, they would be, completely ignoring very deliberately, because they know that the most intensive period of economic growth in Western economies was at the time when you had peak taxation rates. In the 60s, taxation rates were much higher than what they are now after decades of neoliberal reversal, And in the 60s, you had much more impressive rates of economic growth and the rest than what you have now. And economies which were much healthier, actually, in the kind of development that they had, which was not like those financial bubbles and the rest that we have been seeing over the last decades. So that's why I'm saying, I mean, it is indeed wishful thinking to believe that neoliberalism was just due to some economic logics vanish. No, not at all. I wrote a little piece on that a few weeks ago, but just to explain that economic paradigms are the result of social balances of forces. They are the result of the class balance, the balance of class forces. They are not the result of some, intellectual progresses or whatever. It's not a matter of knowledge. It's not like scientific revolutions and the paradigm shift in sciences, which are the results of advances in knowledge. When it comes to the economy, the shifts of paradigms reflects the actual balance of social forces. And that's what would need to be changed if there is to be any way out of the neoliberal hegemony of the last decades.
Sure, but maybe I could challenge you there. Indeed, I think that the balance of social forces and the political orientation and the battle of wills and power is certainly going to be decisive. But at the same time, we have two instances, one in 2007/8 financial crisis, and today with the COVID crisis, we have very obvious interventions by the top levels of government to intervene in markets. And even though COVID is not a market derived crisis, it's very obvious that the markets themselves are not able to solve these two crises. Is it possible, or are we witnessing any divisions within the actual political or economic centers of power that are determining ideology/policy, that they are forced to rethink their neoliberalism, not simply one being a factor of the balance of social forces versus those who govern them?
I don't see that coming, and again, it's not, it has to reflect the real economic forces, the kind of capitalism that you have. There hasn't been a shift in the kind of capitalism that we have. And there hasn't been a shift in the balance of social forces between capital and labor. So without one of those shifts, you can't envisage a shift of the economic paradigm. So whatever they are doing, as they did you're right to point to what happened after 2007-8, I mean, during the Great Recession, as it's called, even though it is much less than what we are seeing now. But at that time, you had a huge lot of comments on that. And I mentioned in the piece that I referred to, which I published a few weeks ago, that Newsweek came out at that point, that was in 2009, with "We are all socialists now." And when you look at that, you smile like you're doing, Toufic. That's exactly the reaction which is expected and normal, because that was so naive. And in the same way, but I mean, no one is saying today that people have learned the lesson, I think. So you don't have those covers saying "We are all socialists now." You don't find them any longer. And basically, what they are doing now, they see as exceptional measures facing an exceptional situation. That doesn't mean a shift in the paradigm. Yeah? That means a temporary derogation, a temporary deviation from the rule, which is forced on them. Of course, they had no other choice. Otherwise, it would be a general economic collapse with social chaos, absolute social chaos. So they fear that. So they are not crazy. I mean, in the sense that they are dogmatic. Neoliberalism is very dogmatic, but the limits to that dogmatism are the interests of capitalism. And so today it's a matter of providing for this interest, and that's why they are doing what they are doing. But it's not, again, it's not a change of the rules. It's just a temporary deviation from the rule, and the goal remaining not the health of the people, the health of the economy. And that's why, I mean, one thing, the only thing that you can take for granted is that there will be a massive increase in health expenditure in the years to come compared to what we were having. That is, neoliberalism was systematically eroding health expenditure through various mechanisms. But if you take even rich countries like Britain, for instance, this erosion has been very, very sharp. Now, it's obvious that this is over, that already they are injecting funds in the health system, and after, even when all this is over, when you have a vaccine or whatever, they will carry on with a high level of expenditure. But that won't be because they care for the people. It will be because they fear the repetition of the crisis, the economic crisis. Mm-hmm. Their big problem was more the economic crisis than the health crisis. Hence, what you had in this country, in the United Kingdom, a government which was explaining to you that, okay, there is a price to pay in human lives and all that, in order to acquire herd immunity and not to disrupt the economy. And you see the far right all over the world, from Trump, Bolsonaro, and all that, is saying the economy is more important. That's the far right of neoliberalism. You know? They put it bluntly: the economy is more important. Profit comes before life. That's the core principle of these people.
Well, thank you for establishing both a set of understandings around neoliberalism and how COVID has begun to impact that, as well as the illusions or not around what it will mean for the sustainability of these economic paradigms. With that said, I'd like to begin to transition into the third dimension of this talk, which has to do with the Arab Spring, which, if everyone noticed, has inverted commas around it. Now, before we begin to blend together COVID and neoliberalism with the Arab Spring, you are known as an intellectual who has written extensively on the political, economic, and developmental challenges that exist across the Middle East and North Africa. I'd like to give you an opportunity to explain to our audience, insofar as this is obviously a very large region with a lot of complicated historical, economic, political, economic problems, what is some of your own understanding of, because it didn't, the crisis of what is happening across the Middle East and North Africa didn't start with the COVID, it started well before, but certainly we saw major upheavals around the end of 2010, 2011, known as the Arab Spring. So firstly, why the inverted commas around Arab Spring? And can you give us a little bit of a sense of what you see as the main drivers behind this sort of cluster of problems that have led to this massive revolutionary upheaval, which has lasted to this point upwards of 10 years, although the future of it we do not know.
Right. Well, I mean, Arab Spring, why are there inverted commas? I mean, actually, I'm not sure I put those inverted commas.
I did.
I can't remember. But it's because it's a kind of label which is not necessarily very clear whether you're speaking about just the first time it was used, which was 2011, or are we speaking of the whole set of uprisings up to those of last year, 2019? That's why there's some confusion on that. When the term was first used in 2011, I was very reluctant to use it because of the illusions that were encapsulated in that formula. The illusion that it would be, relatively brief in time, short in time, smooth, silmiya, peaceful, and something resembling the Eastern European changes of 1989 to the early 90s. And that was a huge illusion. And I warned against this kind of illusion, to which I counterposed the concept of a long-term revolutionary process. That indeed what started in 2011 or December 2010 in Tunisia, if you want to be very accurate, it's basically 2011, was much more than a spring. It was the beginning of a long-term revolutionary process that will carry on for a very long time, for many years to come. Actually, I would always say many years to come, and even decades. And we are already close to the end of the first decade. Why was I saying that from the beginning? It is because of my understanding of the explosion was not a matter just of sudden longing for democracy, and freedom, as it was portrayed in the global media. One more of those Eastern European kind of changes. No, it was actually much deeper than that. It was the political expression of a deeply rooted social economic crisis, which resulted from decades of very slow growth, and sometimes even through some years negative when compared to the demographic growth. With one major symptom out of that being the fact that this part of the world held the record in youth unemployment, the highest rates of youth unemployment in the world for a very long time, before 2011. And so you understand that this is a key factor in the explosion. And this has built up, actually, in some way, there probably was less oppression, political oppression in 2010 than at the previous moment of the last few decades. So that wasn't where the site of accumulation. The site of accumulation was social economic. The accumulation of crisis, of anger, of roots of anger, leading to the explosion in 2011. And hence, when you understand this, you understand that this explosion in itself, actually, not only it won't solve the crisis, the social economic crisis, it can only worsen it, because the conditions created by the upheaval themselves are going to worsen the general condition of the functioning of those type of economies. And therefore, that means we entered into a long tunnel, which is a revolutionary process, which will have, like any long-term, and it's not the first one in history, far from it, any long-term revolutionary processes, ups and downs, upsurges and setbacks, uprisings, backlashes, and we got into that. Now, since then, the term Arab Spring has taken a different meaning, which is just referring to the upheaval, the uprising. In that sense, I don't have a problem with the term, actually. So it was good to speak last year of a second Arab Spring, in the sense of a second wave of revolutionary upsurges, which started in December 18, this time, 8 years later, and then in Sudan, then spread to Algeria, February 2019, and then from there in October to Iraq, and then to Lebanon. So 4 countries got into uprising mode that you have to add to the 6 countries that had entered into uprising mode in 2011, whatever happened after. That means that until now, we've had a total of 10 countries in the region. That is close to half the states of the region, especially if you take the population on board, that would get much more than half. that had witnessed major uprisings. And that's still, I mean, that's, again, we are very far from the end of that. We are still in the early phase of this process. After decades, when people will look at that, and they will see it as this, and they will see that the years that this first decade of the Arab Spring, or whatever it's called, of the Arab revolutionary process, as just the starting phase of all that. And so to get back now to Corona.
Yeah, can we introduce how COVID begins to impact these dynamics, please?
Exactly. So once you understand that, and that's why it was important to explain this, you can see that this will be very much affected, of course, by the crisis. The region has been affected like other parts of the world, and one should say much less than other parts of the world until now, by the health dimension, by the pandemic. The Middle East and North Africa are not the most affected parts of the world. The rates of death and all that are very, very moderate compared to Britain, which now has the highest in the world. So that is not where you will have the main impact. But when it comes to the economic impact, because you have two COVID-19 crises, one is the pandemic, one is medical, but the other is economic. That one which is very likely to last much longer than the medical one, but the health one. That crisis is going to affect brutally this part of the world, and more brutally than other parts of the world, for one reason, which is the addiction of this region to hydrocarbons, to oil and gas. As you know, as everybody knows, because it's been so much in the news since March, you've had a very, very sharp drop in oil prices. Actually, they have been declining since 2014, and they dropped very brutally since March. And the prospects are not at all prospects of getting back to high prices in any foreseeable, future now, because of the crisis, the economic crisis, because of the long-term effects of this crisis. For instance, when you think of work from home, which will inevitably expand hugely after this, how this affects transports, which won't get back anytime soon to the level of before the pandemic, the global transport, air traffic and all that. When you think of all that, you see a number of reasons why the demand for oil won't get back to where it was last year, which means that the depression of oil prices is a long-term phenomenon. This has to be taken for granted. And since so many of the economies of the region were either directly depending on oil exports or indirectly through the Gulf money, through the money coming from rich oil exporters, essentially from the Gulf, into their economies through various forms, whether private investment, state funding, or aid, or whatever, then you understand that the whole economy of the region is going to get even more depressed than what has been the case until now. And that means, and here we close the circle, if you want, since the roots of the explosion in 2011 were social economic in this protracted slow motion economies that you had in the region, then this is going to get even worse than what it has been until now. That means massive unemployment, massive youth unemployment, but not only youth unemployment, all kinds of unemployment, huge increase in poverty, and all that. All the figures will go in the red, will go in the alarm section, and that's why you can safely bet on the fact that social turmoil, social and political turmoil, will increase. It has been already very high since 2011. That is, when you say long-term revolutionary process, that also meant that there was no way this part of the world would recover some kind of stability, in quote marks, as it had been during 3 decades, more or less, before the explosion. That kind of stability is over. It finished in 2011, and we entered into a period of intense destabilization. Even where you had setbacks and all that, it's a very precarious kind of stabilization, like in Sisi's Egypt, for instance, which can explode any time. So this will just increase. This instability will increase tremendously in the next phase, and therefore the big question will be, as it has been from the start, the question of whether you have or not the emergence of a coalition of forces or whatever it is that can play the role of political leadership into steering the popular anger and the popular protest into real change at the political, social, and economic level. That's the big question. The only, or the most, let's say, let's put it that way, the most advanced experience in that regard is that of Sudan. Anyone interested, they can find its open access now on Le Monde Diplomatique. My article published a few weeks ago, actually at the beginning of this month, 3 weeks ago, on Sudan, the Sudanese revolution at the crossroads. It's open access, as my other articles, including on this second Arab Spring, it's told. So that's an interesting experience, which is in a transitory, precarious phase. But aside from that, this question, this problem of the leadership is there as a big problem with no solution on the horizon, whether in Algeria, whether in Lebanon, whether in Iraq, the 3 other countries, aside from Sudan, there are no leaderships emerging that could steer this huge popular potential and youth potential and women potential into real change.
But perhaps, I mean, although all the indicators show that things, I mean, the International Monetary Fund came out with a report just last month saying that there was going to be a 3.3% retreat economically, that the MENA region would undergo the worst economic recession in 4 decades. But is there any potential, do you think, that a crisis like the COVID crisis, particularly where the state of the Arab revolutions are, so to speak, that it could actually freeze the process? Because particularly insofar as, even though we may see the situation worsening and deteriorating, on another level, there's certain issues around people being extremely scared that things are going to get much worse, in addition to the fact that you have collective action problems around how do you organize protests in a context of where you're not even allowed to be very close with other people. And these are problems, of course, that other social and political movements are challenged by. But in a context like the Middle East, it's worth hearing what you have to say about that. Excuse me, I'm going to close the door too, because the settlers in the neighborhood have just turned on some music. So, but please go ahead. I'll be back.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the impact of the pandemic, the impact of the health issue, of course, was there, and for instance, where it's most visible is that it ended the weekly demonstrations in Algeria and created conditions which were seized by the government in order to you know, arrest people and all that, and try to really repress the movement in a way that would prevent it from resuming once those conditions are more or less over. So there is an attempt in Algeria at intimidating people away from any attempt to resume the movement. But again, the depth of the social economic crisis is such that not only state repression won't be enough to deter it, but not even the virus is enough to deter it. Just look at what you have in Lebanon. I mean, okay, not the huge kind of mobilization that you had in October, November 2019, but still, people are getting back to the streets. Same can be said about Iraq, but even beyond the region where you have sharp consequences of neoliberalism, as in Chile. Or take Hong Kong, which is a different case. It's not directly social economic, although the background of this discontent is also, even in Hong Kong, social economic. But I mean, what you get is people going back to the streets, whatever. I mean, virus or no virus, when you reach conditions where you know, you can't survive economically, so you're going to let it out, and that's what we'll see.
Okay, I'd like to sort of shift to another theme that is consistent when we talk about analysis of the Arab uprising, so to speak, which is the involvement of external actors in the organic processes of these movements. Obviously, within each state context, there's a lot of political and organizational, institutional questions have been raised by these, but something that hasn't helped, or perhaps we could talk about their effect, has been the large impact of different sets of actors in these revolutionary processes, whether these are trans-Arab interactions, largely Arab Gulf states and perhaps Egypt, which have become involved in some of these revolutionary theaters, or we of course have powerful regional actors, most particularly Iran and Turkey, who have played some significant roles, perhaps also on a minor level, even Israel. And then we also have the larger dimension, which is the role of the bigger international players, such as the US, EU, and Russia. So I'd like to hear, because we're sort of running out of time, or we'd like to head to some questions, but on these three different levels, if you could begin to speak to how the COVID crisis and the ensuing economic crisis will begin to impact the ability to intervene of all these three sets of actors upon the dynamics that we described previously. Big question.
I mean, I think that first, if you take the regional players, they aren't at the same level, of course, economically. That is, those Gulf states, of course, they will be affected by the crisis, and we see that the Saudi Kingdom itself has gone into implementation of further austerity measures. There were already a few austerity measures from the previous years, but they have been increased. But on the one hand, they still have a lot of money, and they will prioritize whatever they see as defense of their vital interest, and because that's the most important for them, that their survival as states and all that is at stake. We can expect, I mean, it is more likely that a country like Iran, which is in a much more difficult economic situation, will have difficulty continuing its kind of expansion beyond its borders, interventions in the region. But here again, I mean, these clashes, the struggle has become so intense that you can't bet on economic rationality. You see what I mean? That is, it goes beyond economic rationality, because you have here political, ideological, and all kinds of factors that are playing a key role. The state of Israel is taking advantage of all that and of the existence of the presence of Donald Trump at the helm of the United States into going further in the annexation of whatever land you have between the Jordan River and the sea. Soon, what will be left to the so-called Palestinian Authority will be, I mean, left to claim a Palestinian state over will be close to 15% of the land that you have between the river and the sea. So that's here a state that is taking advantage of all these conditions, the state of Israel. As for Russia, United States, and all that, I mean, first, the United States, as you know, the politics of the United States is also, I mean, depends on who is at the helm. You have had a clear shift with Donald Trump in some of the stances in foreign policies, depending on if he is re-elected or you have Joe Biden or whatever, things may change. But the country that might be more affected than the United States is China, in that sense. Not as a political player, but as an economic player, especially with the huge increase of debt globally, a big part of which is now owned by China as the creditor state. This will have severe economic implications. So how this affects the region, it's really difficult to tell. If you look at what's happening, despite this coronavirus crisis and all that, you haven't had any relent or any slowdown or anything of the ongoing fights, you know, whether in Syria, in the Idlib region and all that, or even more so in Libya, you have increased intervention. Turkey increased its intervention in Libya. Russia increased its intervention in Libya. The two are fighting each another by proxy and all that. So, I mean, it's. I don't think there's anything to expect from that point of view. That you will have less foreign interventions or whatever of the kind in the region. Nothing indicates that this might happen. Oh, you're...
Even with the drastic need to spend and divert spending into healthcare costs and a more isolationist tendency that seems to be brewing that you see in the US or in EU at least, I mean, you don't see these pulling back. I mean, for instance, I mean, the uprisings have made huge, have had huge implications on and created huge refugee populations. The whole Palestinian economy, the Syrians, the Lebanese, the Jordanians. This is the region that is at this stage hugely dependent upon aid and provision that is coming from Western donors. And we sense not only a sort of hunkering down and a need to sort of invest locally in these countries, but also keep the immigrant and a xenophobia that's being built and a bit more of an isolationism. Do you see that being able to, that changing the dynamics, or are these really simply like much larger geopolitical factors that their whole well-being of these states is dependent upon, whether the people like it or not?
Look, not everybody can afford isolations. The United States is a special case. It's a huge economy. It's a huge country. It has huge resources. And it has very little, it doesn't depend on exports. I mean, the degree of dependence of the US economy on exports is very limited. So it can afford to play it isolationist, a la Trump, right? China, for instance, can't play that game because, or Germany for that matter. These are export-dependent countries. So, and the whole of Europe is in the same boat in that regard. So now, the United States has been on this isolationist kind of road under Trump over the last few years. What does it mean? It doesn't mean full isolationism in the sense of withdrawal from every entanglement abroad. It's just withdrawal from where there are no vital interests for the United States. That's basically. Maybe the most symbolic of all that is what happened in Syria. Donald Trump redeployed the troops from fighting alongside the Kurds, whom they used to defeat ISIS, into concentrating on the oil fields of Syria. So, I mean, this is so symbolic. It means our troops will be where we have interest, where it is interesting for us to be, where it pays, right? So, of course, it pays for the United States to be in the Gulf countries. These countries pay a lot. They contribute to funding the US federal budget. They contribute to pouring fuel into the engine of the US economy and all that. And that's a very important prize. The clash with Iran will carry on because what is at stake is this area of major interest. Syria, the United States is not that interested. Libya, you see very little interest, except now that Russia is stepping up its intervention. What you may see is more US support to Turkey, actually, in this regard. But ultimately, the logic is interests, and not any kind of purely ideological isolationism. It's just a matter of not being, well, we don't want to be the global cop and spend money for the rest of the world where we don't have an interest at stake. So we'll have troops where it's interesting for us.
Thank you. Well, we're almost out of time. Well, not quite, but I'd like to invite audience members to send in their questions, and we'll be happy to raise them to Professor Achcar. We have two questions right now up there that I'll throw out to you, Professor Achcar. The first one is from Farah Baba, who writes, in the case of Lebanon, a lot of protesters and local leadership in the regions actually consider that the absence of a national revolutionary leadership was behind the success of keeping the momentum of protests going on for almost 7 months now. In your opinion, how do you think the ongoing socio-economic crisis could change this political culture of rejecting political leadership in an attempt to reach the real change that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a good remark, and thank you for that. Well, it's double-edged. That is, the lack of a leading body can be seen as having been a facilitated circumstance for the uprising, the October uprising, the 17th of October uprising, as it's called in Lebanon. Why so? Precisely because of the weakness of political organizations representing the interests of the population and the masses that were protesting. Any attempt at setting up some kind of leadership would have faced a lot of problems and would have been an easy prey for the classical tool through which the ruling class in Lebanon tried to always diffuses social struggles, which is sectarianism, So you would get into who is represented and why these guys are not these people, or why, every kind of issues will get into the picture. So the fact of being a kind of leaderless movement allowed it to function, but that was because there was no leadership that had any legitimacy, or the degree of legitimacy that would have been needed to be a consensual leadership. You had one in Sudan. You have no consensual leadership in the other countries, Iraq, Lebanon, and Algeria. Take Algeria, where you don't have a sectarianism or whatever. Even in Algeria, because of the weakness of all political organizations that you had this popular movement, very grassroots, very horizontal, and it's very networking. But that was also the expression of the lack of political organizations and groups that would be able to play the role of legitimate leadership. That is a leadership that is consensually recognized by the movement, by the popular movement. That's why I said it's double-edged. It allows the movement to carry on, because it doesn't get into these troubles of who's leading and who's pretending to lead and all that. But on the other hand, this absence of leadership is a huge weakness. And I would say the movement of Lebanon paid the price already. It's not accurate to say that it has been there for 7 months. It went down very sharply already by the beginning of this year, even before this corona virus crisis. There was a real, and with the government of Hassan Diab and all that, the whole movement subsided, it declined, and it hasn't recuperated the kind of impetus that it had in last autumn. So no, all in all, definitely the issue is really this big problem of the emergence of leaderships, which don't need to be political parties. It can very well be in the form of what played the role, or the key role in leading the Sudanese uprising, which is the Sudanese Professional Association, which is an association of unions, professional unions, but then even teachers' unions, workers' unions, and even such leaderships. Whatever can really organize and speak in the name of the popular movement, and whatever can have the legitimacy to speak in the name, and then you can have results. But again, when you take Algeria, you take Lebanon, aside from few general slogans, the demonstrators know much more what they don't want than what they want. And of course, the lack of program, the lack of clear demands is a weakness.
Well, that's fascinating. I wonder, I hear what you say, and to some extent, I also, from my knowledge of the Tunisian experience, recognize that the Tunisian Confederation of Unions played to some extent a stabilizing force as being able to help in that revolutionary transition. But in a context like Lebanon, where you have, now I'm not an expert on Lebanon, and that's why I'm asking the question to you, structurally economic benefits are provided to some extent as part and parcel of that sectarian system. So how easy is it to form cross-class-based interests in a context where whole economic sectors are seen as privy to a certain sectarian stream? No?
No, you have a huge ground for cross-class and cross-sectarian, cross-sectarian movement. Cross-class in the sense of whole sections of the middle class joining the working class, the poorer classes, the unemployed, and all that, because actually the very idea of middle class, I mean, what you could call middle class in Lebanon has shrunk tremendously with the ongoing crisis. Now, don't forget that Lebanon went into a very deep economic crisis since last autumn. It exploded in the autumn, and it has reached huge dimensions for a little country like Lebanon, with a huge unemployment, with a huge collapse in the purchasing power of people, and even full poverty. I mean, huge. So the implications have been enormous. And so this affects a range of social layers and affects all sects, people from all sects. And whatever kind of side benefits you could have through the sectarian system in the past, they have eroded. I mean, all this has collapsed. The Lebanese currency has collapsed, in the way that you see in those countries where you have those big economic crises like you have now in Lebanon. So, the ground is there, but the issue is the lack of forces able to coalesce all that into a political force. That's the point. You have the ground, but you don't have those who can build on it. You don't have builders, if you want. Okay. The ground is there, but you don't have builders. That's the accumulation of failures over a long period. That's the role of sectarianism in affecting politics in Lebanon. That's the role of sectarian regional allegiances. Also Iran, Syria, Saudi Kingdom, blah, blah. So all this has weakened a lot the political scene in Lebanon, and hence this absence of forces having any kind of legitimacy to represent the people.
Thank you for that answer. We'll take one more question. Also, if anybody else has questions, we might have an opportunity to get in yet a second one, but I'll read the question that's come in from Yazid Zada. He says, listening to the definition of neoliberalism that you gave on the one hand, and what has happened since the outbreak of COVID-19 on the other, one can notice that the state is taking more space. Public services such as health are receiving state financial support. Privatized sectors are more or less nationalized. Take the British Railway or the German air company Lufthansa. How do you see the strong return of the state in light of how you've defined neoliberalism? How do you see this happening in oil-dependent countries like Saudi Arabia, which has minimized its social coverage expenses and raised VAT?
Right. I don't know if the person who asked the question attended our exchange from the beginning, because I addressed at least the first part of the question in explaining that this massive injection of state funds in the economies is seen by the neoliberal governments as an exceptional measure for an exceptional time. It's not seen as a change of policy and a shift in economic logics and economic policies. No, they see it really as a situation of emergency requiring this injection of funds to prevent the general collapse of the economy and social chaos, as we said at the beginning. But they will revert to their kind of policies later on. And one key issue will be who will pay for that. And as I said, they won't be inclined to go back to the very high taxation rates that you had in the 60s, in those years of global, of economic boom in Western countries. You had very, very high marginal taxation rates. They won't go back to that. They will, on the contrary, try to freeze wages, reduce wages, reduce benefits, and all that in the name of austerity and debt, and we have to pay back, and explaining, well, you know, that was from God, and this COVID-19 is not our fault, so we are all on the same boat and we have to pay for it. And of course, the logic is completely flawed because we're not on the same boat. They bear, they have they are those who are responsible for the high cost of the crisis wherever it is. Like take this country where I am, the United Kingdom, which is now the record in the world in the rate of death. It's a total disaster, but that has been one of the most rabid neoliberal governments in the world, which went further than any other or most other at least Western European governments in that respect. It's getting close to what you have in the United States. It's the closest to what you have in the United States, and this went along with a huge increase in social inequality, with a huge fortunes accumulated at the top, and de facto, impoverishment of at the grassroots. So that's the point. Now, when what about the Saudi kingdom in that regard? The state in the Saudi kingdom has always been a huge actor in the economy for an obvious reason, because by far the largest chunk of the economy is oil and gas, which is state-owned. And yet you had this attempt at privatizing this partially by the crown prince with the partial privatization of Aramco. And we've seen the lack of appetite of private money to go there. I mean, you would think on the face of it, wow, that's excellent investment opportunity. But the kind of prices they wanted and the lack of confidence, and that's a key problem for the whole region, which explains, and which I very much emphasize as the key to understanding this very low, very slow kind of economic development that you had, and why neoliberalism, even if it could function somewhere, it definitely can't function in this part of the world. It is because private capital won't go into any kind of major investments, long-term investments in this part of the world, because it doesn't have confidence in the existing political, legal, and other conditions. And you have a good illustration of it in the Saudi kingdom, where they had to force people to acquire those shares. So yeah, these conditions will only increase, and this reluctance of private money to go into any kind of real developmental, let alone the Aramco kind of thing, but I'm speaking here of real developmental investment, this will be even less than the already extremely low level at which it was.
Well, thank you, Gilbert. We're basically at time, and I can hear your voice is beginning to give out, so I don't want to test you any further. But thank you so much for the insight and analysis that you've been able to provide for us tonight and for our audience. I'd like to welcome audience members to be able to check out our website, www.cbrl.ac.uk, where regular discussions of this nature, as well as other activities of CBRL, will be conducted. And you can sign up there to be a member or see what we're doing. Just check us out. Other than that, I'd like to just thank our audience and our guest for all the insight he's been able to provide. You can find him at SOAS, where you can read more about some of his books. He's also had some very important articles that have recently come out in Jacobin, as well as New Politics, providing some of this analysis in written format. So thank you today for your time, and everybody please stay safe and rest at home, stay socially distant, and thank you for your time today. All the best.
Thank you, Toufic. Thank you all.
Salamat.
Bye-bye.